There are bonds forged in blood that defy all logic. Bonds that endure through decades of silence, through years of unspoken devotion, through sacrifices that should have bought freedom, but instead purchased something far darker. What happens when a man spends 20 years saving another man's life, only to discover that gratitude has an expiration date? That loyalty can be measured in dollars. That the moment death arrives, even the most sacred debts are forgotten. This is not a ghost story. There are no spirits here, no supernatural forces reaching from beyond the grave. This is something worse, a true account of human nature at its most complex and disturbing. A story about debt and dependency, about promises made and broken, about two men whose lives became so intertwined that neither could exist without the other. Even as the very foundation of their bond was built on ownership, on slavery, on the brutal reality that one man could be property and savior simultaneously. Before we descend into this tale that has haunted North Carolina for over a century and a half, if you're drawn to stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history, stories where the real horror comes not from the supernatural, but from the choices people make, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the last word is spoken. This is the story of Marcus Hartwell and Caleb, two men whose names appear together in fragmentary records, in courthouse documents, in letters that survived fires and floods and the collapse of an entire way of life. Two men bound together by a contract neither fully understood until it was far too late to renegotiate its terms. The story begins in 1842. But to truly understand it, we need to go back further to 1818, when Caleb was born in a cabin on the Hartwell Plantation, 3 miles from the Capefer River in southeastern North Carolina. The Hartwell family had owned land in North Carolina since before the Revolution. They were not among the wealthiest plantation families, not like the Camerons or the Burgwins, who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people, but they were comfortable, respectable. The kind of family that attended the right churches and sent their sons to the right schools and married into the right families. Jonathan Hartwell, Marcus's father, owned 43 people when he died in 1842. Among them was a woman named Sarah who worked in the main house as a cook. She had been born on the plantation in 1798, had spent her entire life within a 10-mile radius of the big house, had never learned to read or write, but could recite Bible verses from memory, and knew the names of every medicinal plant that grew in the Carolina lands. Sarah gave birth to Caleb in the winter of 1818. The father was never officially acknowledged, though household records show that Jonathan Hartwell ordered a doctor summoned for the birth unusual care for an enslaved woman's child, suggesting a particular interest in the baby's welfare. Some of the older enslaved people whispered that Caleb bore a striking resemblance to Jonathan's younger brother, who had lived on the plantation until his death from fever in 1820. But these were only whispers, and whispers had no power to change reality. Caleb grew up in the strange liminal space occupied by enslaved children on southern plantations. Until the age of 7 or 8, he played with Marcus and Marcus's sister, Elelena. Their childhood unfettered by the full weight of the racial hierarchy that would eventually separate them completely. They fished in the creek, climbed trees, built forts from fallen branches, and engaged in the universal activities of children who don't yet understand that the world has already decided their fates. But childhood ends, and by the time Caleb was 10, he was working in the stables. By 12, he was in the tobacco fields during harvest season. By 15, he was back in the main house, assigned to household duties because Sarah had convinced the overseer that her son was too valuable to waste on field labor. He was intelligent, she argued, quick to learn, able to anticipate needs before they were spoken. She didn't say what she really meant, that she saw something in her son's eyes that frightened her. A watchfulness, a way of seeing patterns that others missed. An intelligence that would be dangerous in the fields where smart slaves were often suspected of planning rebellion, but might be useful. Might even be protective in the controlled environment of the house. Sarah died in 1837 of consumption, coughing blood into rags she burned so no one would see the evidence of her illness and decide she wasn't worth the cost of care. Caleb was 19 years old. He stood in the slave cemetery while they buried his mother in an unmarked grave, and he did not cry. He simply watched, memorizing every detail, storing it away with all the other observations he kept locked behind his careful, neutral expression. Marcus Hartwell was 21 that year. He had just returned from 2 years at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where he'd studied literature and philosophy, and emerged with the confident polish of a young man who'd never had to question whether he'd have enough to eat, whether he'd have a home, whether he'd be sold away from everyone he'd ever known. He and Caleb had not spoken in years. They existed in the same house, but moved through entirely different worlds. Marcus barely noticed the young man who brought him his breakfast, who cleaned his room, who stood at attention during dinner parties to refill wine glasses. This was the natural order. This was how things had always been. And then Jonathan Hartwell died. Jonathan's death was not dramatic. He simply failed to wake up one April morning in 1842. The doctor determined it was his heart. He'd been overweight, sedentary, prone to fits of anger that left him red-faced and gasping. His heart had simply given out, as hearts sometimes do. At 26, Marcus inherited everything: the plantation, the debts, the 43 people whose lives he now owned completely. He also inherited his father's business problems. Jonathan had been a poor manager, had invested in failing ventures, had borrowed heavily against future tobacco crops that never yielded the returns he'd promised. Marcus found himself drowning in obligations he'd never expected to face so soon, and with no real understanding of how to manage an estate, he made mistakes, costly ones. In those first months, Marcus would sit in his father's study, now his study, and try to make sense of ledgers that never seemed to balance. He would review bills and promissory notes and feel panic rising in his chest. The walls of the plantation, which had always felt like protection, began to feel like a prison. It was during one of these late-night accounting sessions, 3 months after his father's death, that Marcus first really noticed Caleb. The young man had brought coffee, as he did every evening. But instead of simply setting down the tray and leaving, Caleb hesitated. "Permission to speak, sir?" Marcus looked up, irritated by the interruption. "What is it?" "The Johnson tobacco, sir. In the ledger, you're being charged 3 cents per pound more than the market rate." Marcus stared at him. "What did you say?" "The Johnson tobacco, the entry from last April. It's 3 cents per pound higher than what Mr. Patterson paid for the same grade. I saw the invoices when I was filing papers in the office." Marcus looked down at the ledger, his pulse quickening. He found the entry, did the calculation. Caleb was right. "You can read?" Marcus asked, though it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write in North Carolina. "No, sir," Caleb replied calmly. "But I can recognize numbers and patterns. My mother taught me. It was a lie, of course." Sarah had taught Caleb to read in secret, using a Bible stolen from the main house, teaching him by candlelight in their cabin after everyone else was asleep. But admitting that would put both of them. Well, Caleb now, since Sarah was dead, in danger. Marcus studied the young man before him with new eyes. "You've been paying attention to the household accounts. I file the papers, sir. I can't help but notice. And you noticed this discrepancy?" "Yes, sir." Marcus leaned back in his chair. An intelligent slave was valuable, but also potentially dangerous. His father had always warned against educating them, against allowing them too much knowledge. But his father was dead and Marcus was desperate. "Are there other errors you've noticed?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "Several, sir." "Show me." That night, Caleb identified 6 other accounting errors in the plantation books. Some were honest mistakes. Others appeared to be deliberate fraud by suppliers or traders who assumed the young, inexperienced Marcus wouldn't notice. When they finished, it was nearly 2:00 in the morning. Marcus sat in silence, overwhelmed by the realization that this slave, this man he'd barely acknowledged for years, had been quietly observing, analyzing, understanding the business of the plantation better than Marcus himself. "Why didn't you say something before?" Marcus asked. Caleb met his eyes. "It wasn't my place, sir." "No, I suppose it wasn't." Marcus paused. "But I'm making it your place now. From now on, you'll assist me with the accounts quietly. I don't want the overseer or anyone else knowing, but I want you to review the books and tell me what you see. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get out." Caleb left. Marcus remained in the study, staring at the ledgers, feeling the first stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. Not friendship, that would be impossible. Not even respect exactly, but a recognition, an acknowledgement that this man whose life he owned might be more than just property. It was a dangerous thought, and Marcus pushed it away. But the arrangement continued. Over the following weeks, Caleb's observation saved Marcus thousands of dollars. He identified fraudulent charges, negotiated better rates with suppliers. Through Marcus, of course, a slave couldn't negotiate directly, and helped Marcus understand the seasonal rhythms of tobacco farming that his father had never properly explained. Catherine Bennett entered Marcus's life that summer. She was 19, the daughter of a prominent Charleston merchant, visiting relatives in Wilmington when she and Marcus met at a church social. She was lovely in that particular way. Southern women of that era were expected to be lovely, demure, well-mannered, educated just enough to be interesting, but not so much as to be threatening. Marcus courted her with the intensity of a man who needed something stable in his life, something that made sense when nothing else did. They were engaged by autumn and married in December 1842, in a ceremony that depleted what little savings Marcus had left. Catherine moved into the Hartwell plantation with expectations formed by romantic novels and her mother's advice. She expected to be mistress of a grand house, to host parties and manage servants, and live the gracious life she'd been raised to anticipate. What she found instead was a struggling estate. A husband who spent every evening locked in his study with accounting books, and a strange, unsettling dynamic between Marcus and his house slave that she couldn't quite understand but instinctively disliked. She noticed how Marcus listened when Caleb spoke, really listened with an attention he rarely gave her. She noticed how Caleb moved through the house with a quiet confidence that seemed inappropriate for his station. She noticed the way they communicated, sometimes without words, a glance or gesture conveying meaning that excluded everyone else in the room. Catherine said nothing at first. She was too newly married, too unsure of her position. But she noticed, and she filed those observations away with the same care that Caleb filed business papers, storing them for later use. The summer of 1842 brought heat that seemed to press down on the plantation like a physical weight. The tobacco plants wilted despite constant watering. The enslaved workers moved slowly through the fields, conservation their strength, trying not to collapse from heat exhaustion. Marcus decided to inspect the northern property line where sharecroppers had been cutting timber without permission. It was July 15th, a Wednesday, the hottest day of the year. And this was when everything changed. Marcus rode out alone that morning, despite the overseer's recommendation that he take someone with him. He was 26 years old and still believed that youth conferred invincibility, that nothing truly bad could happen to him because nothing truly bad had ever happened to him before. The property line ran along a marshy area near the river, where cypress trees grew in water dark as coffee and Spanish moss hung from branches like the hair of drowned women. It was beautiful in a melancholy way and also treacherous. The ground was soft, unpredictable. Snakes nested in the undergrowth. Marcus dismounted to examine a tree that showed signs of recent cutting. He was bent over, studying the axe marks when his horse whinnied and stamped nervously. He looked up just in time to see the cottonmouth emerging from the undergrowth. The eastern cottonmouth is a pit viper, identifiable by its white mouth, which it opens wide when threatened, hence the name. Its venom is hemotoxic, destroying red blood cells and causing tissue damage. A bite is rarely fatal to a healthy adult, but rarely is not the same as never. The snake struck at the horse's leg. The horse reared. Marcus was thrown backward, landing hard in mud and water. The impact stunned him, driving the air from his lungs. He lay gasping, disoriented as the snake turned its attention to this new threat. Time slowed in the way it does in moments of extreme danger. Marcus saw the snake coiling, saw its mouth opening to display that distinctive white interior, saw it gathering itself to strike. And then Caleb was there. Later, Marcus would not be able to explain how Caleb had arrived so quickly. He had ridden out alone. Caleb should have been back at the house attending to his duties, but somehow he was there, moving faster than Marcus had known a person could move, bringing a fallen branch down on the snake with precision that killed it instantly. Caleb dragged Marcus out of the mud, examined him quickly. "Are you bitten, sir?" "No, I don't think so. We need to check." "Take off your boots." Marcus complied, his hands shaking with delayed shock. His clothing was soaked, filthy with swamp water. Caleb examined every inch of exposed skin, looking for puncture wounds. "You're not bitten," he confirmed. "But we should get you home. You hit your head when you fell." Marcus touched the back of his skull, and his hand came away bloody. The world tilted slightly. "I can ride." "No, sir, you're confused. I'll take you back." Caleb helped Marcus onto the horse, then swung up behind him. They rode back to the plantation slowly, Caleb's arms steadying Marcus when he swayed. The sun beat down mercilessly. By the time they reached the house, Marcus was half delirious, muttering about snakes and mud and Caleb's impossible appearance. Dr. Cross was summoned from Wilmington. He cleaned the head wound, which was deeper than it had first appeared, and declared that Marcus had suffered a concussion. Bed rest, quiet, no stimulation. It was Catherine who explained what had happened, standing by Marcus's bedside as he drifted in and out of awareness. "The slave boy followed you," she said, her voice carrying an edge Marcus was too injured to identify. "He told the overseer he had a feeling you shouldn't be alone, that something was wrong. The overseer told him to get back to work, but he followed anyway. Apparently he does that. Follows you when you go out riding." Marcus closed his eyes. "He saved my life." "Yes, he did." Catherine's tone was unreadable. "The doctor says, if the snake had bitten you that far from the house, you might not have made it back in time for treatment. I need to thank him." "You own him, Marcus. His life is yours. He was simply protecting your property, himself included." But Marcus knew it was more than that. Caleb had followed him against orders, risking punishment, had been watching over him, protecting him. "Why?" He called for Caleb that evening after Catherine had gone to bed. Caleb stood in the doorway of the bedroom, perfectly still, his expression neutral. "Why did you follow me?" Marcus asked. "I had a feeling, sir." "What kind of feeling?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "You're not ready for this yet. Managing the plantation, navigating all the dangers. Your father protected you from a lot. And now he's gone, and you're learning everything at once, and you're distracted. Distracted people make mistakes. They don't watch where they're stepping, so you appointed yourself my guardian." "I wouldn't use that word, sir." "What word would you use?" Caleb met his eyes. "I'd say I have a vested interest in keeping you alive, sir, because if something happens to you, this plantation gets sold probably, and all of us get sold with it. Families separated. Everything we know gone. So yes, I watch out for you for selfish reasons, if you want to call them that." It was a clever answer. It gave Caleb's actions a motivation that Marcus could understand and accept without having to confront more complicated truths about loyalty and connection, and the strange bond forming between them. "I see," Marcus said. "Well, thank you for your selfishness." "Yes, sir, you can go." Caleb left, but as he closed the door, Marcus called out one more time. "Caleb, sir, stay close. From now on, I want you with me when I ride out, but when I go to town, I want." He hesitated, unsure how to phrase it. "I want your selfishness nearby." "Yes, sir." And that was how it started. The bond, the debt, the arrangement that would define both their lives for the next 23 years. If the snake bite had been an isolated incident, it might have faded into just another plantation story. But it wasn't isolated. Over the following months and years, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Marcus Hartwell, it seemed, was either extraordinarily unlucky or somehow marked for disaster. October 1842. A fire broke out in the tobacco barn at 2:00 in the morning. The cause was never determined. Perhaps a lantern left burning, perhaps smoldering tobacco, perhaps deliberate arson by someone with a grudge against the Hartwells. Whatever the cause, the result would have been catastrophic if Caleb hadn't smelled the smoke. He woke the entire house, organized the enslaved workers into fire brigades, and helped Marcus coordinate the effort to contain the blaze. They lost 40% of that season's tobacco crop. But the main house was saved, and more importantly, no one died. The insurance investigator was suspicious. Fires were common in tobacco country, and insurance fraud was equally common. He questioned Caleb extensively, trying to determine if the slave had set the fire himself to make his master look good. But there was no evidence, just another narrow escape. Just Caleb being in the right place at the right time. December 1842. Marcus's horse threw him during a winter storm. The animal panicked, bolted toward the swollen river. If it had reached the water with Marcus still mounted, both would have drowned. Caleb caught the reins just in time, calming the horse with a touch that bordered on supernatural. March 1843. Marcus ate oysters at a business dinner in Wilmington. By midnight, he was violently ill. Dr. Cross diagnosed food poisoning. But Caleb, who had waited outside the restaurant, insisted on staying with Marcus through the night. When Marcus's breathing became labored and his pulse weakened, Caleb administered Ipax syrup that he'd somehow obtained, forcing Marcus to vomit until the poison was expelled. Dr. Cross later admitted that Marcus might not have survived without that intervention. May 1843, Catherine went into labor 6 weeks early. The baby was breached. Dr. Cross was in Raleigh and couldn't reach the plantation in time. It was Caleb who rode through a thunderstorm to fetch a midwife from a neighboring plantation, a free woman of color named Ruth, who had delivered hundreds of babies and knew techniques that most white doctors dismissed as folk medicine. Ruth saved both Catherine and the baby, a daughter they named Eleanor after Marcus' deceased sister. Catherine hated that she owed Caleb for her life and her daughter's life. Hated the way Marcus looked at Caleb with something approaching awe. Hated the debt that grew larger with each incident. By 1844, the pattern was undeniable. Marcus was alive because of Caleb, not once but multiple times. And with each rescue, with each narrow escape, the bond between them deepened in ways that made everyone around them uncomfortable. The other enslaved people noticed. They called Caleb the Shadow and kept their distance. Some thought he had special powers, was protected by spirits. Others thought he was simply too smart for his own good and would eventually pay for standing out. The white neighbors noticed, too. They whispered about Marcus' dependence on his slave, about how unnatural it was, how it undermined the proper order of things. A man who can't protect himself without a slave's help is no man at all. One neighbor said at a dinner party in 1845, loud enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus' response was cold. A man who can't recognize value in another human being, regardless of their station, is a fool, and I don't do business with fools. The neighbor found himself shut out of Marcus' business dealings. The message was clear. Criticize Caleb, and you made an enemy of Marcus Hartwell. It was power of a sort, strange, inverted power that didn't follow the established rules. Caleb was still enslaved, still property, still had no legal rights. But within the ecosystem of the Hartwell plantation, he wielded influence that transcended his legal status. And Marcus seemed not to notice how unusual this was, or perhaps he noticed and simply didn't care. In 1846, Marcus made Caleb a promise. They were in the study late at night, reviewing accounts as had become their habit. Marcus had been drinking not heavily, but enough to loosen his tongue. "You've saved my life 4 times now," Marcus said, staring into his whiskey glass. 4 times I should have died and didn't because you were there. Just doing what needs doing, sir. No, it's more than that. Marcus struggled to find words. "You're keeping me alive," Caleb deliberately, constantly, as if it's your purpose. "Maybe it is, sir, but why? What do you get from it?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want me to get from it?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. "Freedom," Marcus said finally. "You should get your freedom." "That's what this is about, isn't it? You're earning it. I'm not earning anything, sir. I'm property. Everything I do belongs to you automatically. But it shouldn't." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I'm going to make you a promise, Caleb. For every year you stay with me, for every year you remain loyal, I'm going to set aside money, $200 per year. When you've earned enough, when you've proven yourself beyond any doubt, I'll give you man mission papers and the money I've saved. Enough to start a life as a free man. Do you understand?" Caleb's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Hope, skepticism, fear. "How many years, sir?" 20 years of loyal service and you'll have $4,000 and your freedom. 20 years. Caleb was 28 years old. That meant he would be 48 before he saw freedom. Nearly an entire lifetime of service for something that should have been his birthright, but it was more than most enslaved people ever got. It was a promise, however distant. "I understand, sir," Caleb said quietly. Good, I'll have it drawn up in writing, witnessed legal. Marcus never had it drawn up in writing, never had it witnessed. The promise remained between them, verbal and therefore unenforceable. Whether this was an oversight or deliberate ambiguity, even Marcus might not have been able to say, but the promise was made, and both men lived under its weight for the next 19 years. Time moved differently on the Hartwell plantation. Days blurred together in endless cycles of planting and harvest, heat and rain, work and rest. But for Marcus and Caleb, time was counted in incidents, in moments when death reached out its hand and was pushed away. 1847, Marcus nearly drowned in the Cape Far River when his boat capsized during a fishing trip. Caleb pulled him from the water, performed the procedure now known as rescue breathing, bringing Marcus back from the edge of death for the 5th time. 1848, a rattlesnake in Marcus's boot. Caleb noticed it before Marcus slipped his foot inside. 1849, spoiled meat at dinner that would have caused severe illness, perhaps fatal. Caleb detected the smell and quietly removed Marcus' plate before he could eat. 1850, a loose cinch on Marcus' saddle that would have caused a fall at full gallop. Caleb tightened it at the last moment. Each incident could be explained away. Coincidence, luck, hypervigilance born from years of watching and protecting, but taken together, they formed a pattern that suggested something more. As if death itself was stalking Marcus Hartwell, and only Caleb stood between him and the grave. The plantation prospered during these years. Marcus' business acumen, sharpened by Caleb's observations and advice, made him wealthy. He expanded his land holdings, purchased better equipment, even bought 10 more enslaved workers when a neighboring plantation failed. Catherine bore 2 more children, a son in 1848 who died of fever before his 1st birthday, and another daughter in 1850 who survived. The grief over their son's death drove a wedge between Marcus and Catherine that never fully healed. She blamed him for working too much, for caring more about the plantation than his family. He blamed her for smothering the child, for not calling the doctor soon enough. Neither blamed the fever that had killed thousands of children throughout the South. They needed someone to blame, and they chose each other. In truth, Marcus was retreating into his relationship with Caleb, not sexually. There's no evidence of that kind of intimacy, but emotionally. Caleb was the one person who understood the pressure Marcus felt, the constant weight of responsibility, the fear that everything could collapse at any moment. Caleb became Marcus's confessor, his advisor, his protector, his friend. Though Marcus would never have used that word, because friendships implied equality, and that was impossible between master and slave. But what else could you call a relationship where one man trusts another with his life repeatedly, where they spend hours together each day discussing problems and solutions, where they develop a shorthand communication that excludes everyone else? Catherine watched this bond deepen with growing resentment. She tried to discuss it with Marcus once in 1851. "It's not natural," she said. "The way you depend on him, the way you listen to him." "People talk, Marcus, let them talk. They say you value a slave more than your own family. They don't understand, and then help me understand. Explain to me why you spend more time with Caleb than with your own wife and children." Marcus looked at her with eyes that held both frustration and something like pity. "He saved my life 7 times, Catherine. 7 times? Without him, you'd be a widow. Our children would be orphans. Everything we have would be gone. How can I not value that? You could free him. If you're so grateful, give him his freedom and let him go. I will, when the time is right. When is the time ever right to do the right thing?" Marcus had no answer, because the truth was that he couldn't imagine his life without Caleb. The protection, yes, but also the companionship, the understanding, the presence of someone who saw him clearly and stayed anyway. He was addicted to being saved, and Caleb was his salvation. 1852 brought drought and tension. The tobacco crop suffered. Neighboring plantations began selling their enslaved workers to cover debts. The mood throughout North Carolina was uneasy as whispers of secession and war began to circulate among plantation owners who feared Northern interference with their way of life. In August of that year, the 8th life-saving incident occurred. Marcus was inspecting tobacco plants in the southern field, chewing on hard candy to ward off hunger pangs. The piece of candy, lemon-flavored, imported from Charleston, lodged in his throat with sudden violence. He couldn't breathe, couldn't call for help. His vision began to blur as oxygen deprivation set in. He fell to his knees, clawing at his throat. Caleb ran from 50 yards away, moved behind Marcus, and performed what we now call the Heimlich maneuver. Though it wouldn't be formally named for another 100 years, he wrapped his arms around Marcus, made a fist, and thrust upward into the soft spot below the rib cage with practiced precision. The candy shot out of Marcus's throat. Air rushed back into his lungs, and Marcus's brother-in-law, William, witnessed the entire scene from the edge of the field. What William saw was a slave with his arms around his master, a slave striking his master, a slave in a position that looked from a distance like violence rather than rescue. The accusation came that evening. William burst into the house, his face flushed with alcohol and righteous fury. Catherine's family had come for Sunday dinner, and the meal was interrupted by William shouting, "I saw him hit you." William pointed at Caleb, who stood against the wall in the dining room, ready to pour wine. "That slave put his hands on you, struck you. It's intolerable, Marcus, unforgivable. He needs to be whipped. Better yet, sold. Sold south where they know how to handle uppity slaves." The dining room went silent. Catherine's mother pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Her father leaned back in his chair, watching to see how Marcus would respond. Marcus stood slowly. His voice when he spoke was dangerously quiet. "He saved my life for the 8th time. I was choking. Without his intervention, I would have died in that field. And you want me to punish him for it? He put his hands on you to save me. It doesn't matter." The principle, Marcus interrupted, "is that I'm alive because of him again. And if you ever suggest harming him, you will never set foot on my property again, you or anyone else in your family." Catherine gasped. Her mother began to cry. Her father's face darkened with anger. "You're choosing a slave over your own family," William said incredulously. "I'm choosing life over death. I'm choosing reason over prejudice. I'm choosing." Marcus stopped himself before he said something even more damaging. "Get out, all of you, get out of my house." They left. Catherine's family did not visit the Hartwell plantation again for 5 years, and the story spread throughout the county. Marcus Hartwell had publicly defended a slave against his own kin. The social consequences were immediate and severe. Invitations stopped arriving. Business relationships cooled. Catherine was excluded from ladies' societies. Their daughters found themselves snubbed by other plantation families. Marcus had violated an unspoken rule that white solidarity always took precedence over relationships with enslaved people, no matter the circumstances. But Marcus didn't apologize, didn't try to mend fences. He simply retreated further into the insular world of the plantation with Caleb at his side. Then that night, alone in his study, Marcus pulled out a ledger he kept in a locked drawer. In it, he'd been recording each life-saving incident in careful detail. July 15, 1842. Cottonmouth Snake River property. October 3, 1842. Fire and tobacco barn. December 12, 1842. Horse bolted toward river. March 8, 1843. Poisoned oysters, Wilmington. May 22, 1843. Catherine's difficult labor. And so on through 8 entries now. He added a 9th line. August 17, 1852, choking Southern tobacco field. Then he did something he'd never done before. He calculated the monetary value of his own life. If he died in 1842, Catherine would have inherited a debt-ridden plantation worth perhaps $20,000. But because he'd lived, because he'd had 16 more years to build and expand and prosper, the plantation was now worth over $80,000. Caleb had, through his interventions, generated $60,000 in value, and Marcus had promised him $4,000 for 20 years of service. The math was obscene. The disparity was staggering. Marcus closed the ledger and locked it away. Some calculations were too uncomfortable to dwell on. The 1850s passed in a haze of mounting tension. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Every event pushed the nation closer to war, and everyone knew it. Marcus continued to prosper, even as the social costs of his dependence on Caleb grew. He became an outsider among his own class, too unconventional in his treatment of slaves to be fully trusted, too successful to be completely ostracized. Caleb aged into his 40s. His hair began to gray at the temples. Lines formed around his eyes from decades of watching, waiting, protecting. He moved through the house like a ghost, always present but never intrusive, seeing everything and saying little. The other enslaved people on the plantation regarded him with a mixture of awe and resentment. He had privileges they didn't have, better food, private quarters, the master's ear. But he also had a burden they didn't share, the constant responsibility of keeping Marcus alive. Some wondered if Caleb resented his role, if he ever considered not saving Marcus, if he ever fantasized about letting the next snake bite connect, the next horsebolt unchecked, the next meal go untested. If he did, he never showed it. 1856, 9th life saved. A tree branch broke during a storm would have struck Marcus' head. Caleb pushed him aside at the last second. 1857, 10th life saved. Infected wound from a cut not treated properly. Caleb recognized the signs of blood poisoning and forced Marcus to send for the doctor before it was too late. 1858, 11th life saved. Financial disaster averted when Caleb noticed discrepancies in a business contract that would have bankrupted the plantation. 1859, 12th life saved. Runaway caught in Wilmington heading straight for Marcus. Caleb pulled him out of the way. 1860, 13th life saved. Marcus fell through rotted floorboards in the tobacco barn would have broken his neck. Caleb was somehow there to catch him. Each incident reinforced the pattern. Each one added to the debt. Each one made it more impossible to imagine how their arrangement could ever end. Because by now both men understood a terrible truth. Marcus Hartwell could not survive without Caleb. Not because he was incompetent or incapable, but because death was simply more persistent with him than with other men. As if he'd been marked, targeted, singled out for early departure. And only Caleb's constant vigilance kept death at bay. 14 years, Marcus said in December 1860, reviewing his secret ledger. 14 years since I made you that promise. 6 more to go. Caleb, standing in the shadows of the study, said nothing. Do you still want it? Marcus asked. Your freedom. Do you even remember what that would mean anymore? Every day, sir. What will you do when I finally give you the papers? Go north, I expect. Find work life quiet. Will you? Marcus hesitated. Will you ever think about this? About me? About these years? Caleb's expression was unreadable. I expect I'll think about it quite a bit, sir. I hope you won't hate me for taking so much of your life. Hate isn't useful, sir. Takes too much energy. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was something in between. A weary acceptance of circumstances neither man had chosen but both had to live with. When North Carolina seceded from the Union in May 1861, Marcus was 45 years old, too old for active military service, and his prosthetic leg, still worn from the snakebite injury 19 years earlier, provided additional justification for staying home. But the war came to him anyway. Confederate conscription took the plantation's overseer and several of the younger enslaved men. Food became scarce as the Confederate Army commandeered crops. The Union blockade strangled trade. The value of Confederate currency plummeted and enslaved people began running away. It started with small numbers. 1 or 2 people disappearing in the night, heading toward Union lines in coastal North Carolina. Marcus didn't pursue them. He told himself it was because he couldn't afford to hire slave catchers. But the truth was more complicated. He was tired of the system, tired of owning people, tired of everything except his strange, codependent bond with Caleb. By 1862, nearly half the plantation's enslaved workers had fled. The tobacco fields lay out. The main house began to show signs of neglect. Catherine had taken their daughters to Charleston in early 1861, ostensibly to stay with her sister until the war ended. She wrote occasionally brief, formal letters that conveyed information, but no warmth. Marcus understood that his marriage was over in all but name. Catherine would not return, not while Caleb remained, not while Marcus continued to choose his slave over his family. In September 1862, the 15th life-saving incident occurred. Deserters from both armies roamed the countryside, desperate men who'd abandoned their units and now survived by theft and violence. One night, 6 of them attacked the Hartwell plantation. They wanted food, horses, anything valuable. They would have burned the main house and killed everyone inside if Caleb hadn't heard them approaching. He woke Marcus, organized the remaining enslaved workers, distributed the few rifles Marcus kept. They held off the deserters until dawn when the attackers finally fled. In the aftermath, Marcus found Caleb sitting on the porch steps, bleeding from a shallow cut across his ribs where a knife had grazed him. 19 years, Marcus said, sitting down beside him. It was the first time he'd ever sat next to Caleb rather than above him, and the gesture felt both natural and transgressive. It's been 19 years since the snake, Caleb. One more year and I'll give you everything I promised. Yes, sir. Do you believe me? After all this time, do you believe I'll actually do it? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, pressing a cloth to his bleeding side. When he spoke, his voice was soft. I believe you want to do it, sir. I believe you mean it when you say it. Whether you'll actually be able to let me go, he shrugged. That's a different question. I will, I swear it. We'll see, sir. They sat in silence as dawn broke over the plantation, over the tobacco fields gone to seed, over the beginning of the end of everything they'd known. The war ground on. The plantation barely survived. Marcus sold everything that wasn't essential. Furniture, artwork, his wife's jewelry that she'd left behind. He refused to sell any of the remaining enslaved people, even though every other plantation owner in the region was liquidating their human property before Union forces could free them. They're my responsibility, Marcus insisted to a neighbor who pressed him to sell. I won't abandon them, but the neighbor persisted. That one you keep in the house, the clever one. You could get premium price for him even now, especially if you marketed him to plantation owners in Texas or Arkansas, places where the war hasn't reached yet. That alone would cover your debts. Marcus showed the neighbor off his property at gunpoint, but the debts remained and they grew. By spring 1865, Marcus was nearly bankrupt. The Confederate currency he held was worthless. His crops hadn't been harvested in 2 years. The house was crumbling, and then Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. The Confederacy was dead, and Marcus had one final promise to keep. May 1865 arrived with unseasonable heat. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Marcus summoned Caleb to his study on May 18th. The room was nearly empty. All the furniture had been sold except for a desk and 2 chairs. They sat across from each other, and for the first time in 23 years, Marcus did not sit elevated above Caleb. They were in that moment almost equal. 23 years, Marcus said, you've been with me for 23 years, you've saved my life. He consulted his hidden ledger one last time. 18 times, 18 times. I would have died if not for you. He pulled out a document from his desk drawer. I had these drawn up before the war. Manam mission papers. Legal, signed, witnessed. You're free, Caleb. You've earned it 1,000 times over. Caleb took the papers, looking at the words with eyes that had secretly learned to read them decades ago. They were legitimate, legal. They would hold up in any court. There's money, Marcus continued. In an account in Wilmington, I've been setting it aside as promised. He paused, consulting another document. It's $3,800. Not quite the $4,000 I promised, but close. With inflation and the war, it's actually worth more than the original promise would have been. Caleb stared at the numbers. It was more money than most enslaved people saw in their entire lives. Enough to start a real life. Enough to buy land, to build a home, to live as a free man should live. Why now? Caleb asked quietly, because I promised 20 years of loyal service and I'm 3 years late. But better late than never. That's not what I mean. Why now specifically? Why today? Marcus looked down at his hands, because the world has changed. Because slavery is ending whether we wanted to or not. Because he took a deep breath. Because I'm tired, Caleb, tired of this system. Tired of owning people, tired of the weight of it all, and because you deserve to be free while you're still young enough to enjoy it. Caleb was 47 years old, not young but not yet old. He had perhaps 20 or 30 years left if he was lucky, years that could be his own finally. What will you do? Caleb asked after I leave, rebuild, try to save what's left of the plantation. Catherine might come back, though I doubt it. If she doesn't, I'll manage alone. You've never been alone, sir, not for 23 years. No, I suppose I haven't. Marcus met his eyes. I don't know if I can survive without you. I'm not being dramatic. I genuinely don't know. You've been keeping me alive for so long that I've forgotten how to protect myself. You'll learn or you'll die. Either way, it won't be my responsibility anymore." The words were harsh, but Marcus recognized them as truth. For 23 years, Caleb had carried the burden of Marcus' survival, and now that burden was being lifted. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Marcus said quietly. "I hope you find a life that's worth all the years you gave me." Caleb stood, folding the Manum mission papers carefully and putting them in his pocket. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. This isn't generosity. This is paying a debt I should have paid years ago." Caleb nodded once and turned to leave. "Caleb," he paused at the door, "will you—" Marcus's voice caught. "Will you say goodbye before you go?" "I think it's better if I don't, sir. Clean break, easier that way," and he left. Marcus sat alone in the empty study and allowed himself to feel the full weight of loss for the first time in his life. But there was a second document Marcus had prepared. A document he kept in a different drawer, locked away where no one would see it. A bill of sale dated May 23, 1865, for one male slave, approximately 47 years old, intelligent and healthy, to be sold to a trader named Jackson from Mississippi for the sum of $800. Marcus had arranged the sale weeks earlier, even as he was preparing Caleb's manumission papers. The correspondence with Jackson was meticulous. Negotiations over price, descriptions of Caleb's capabilities, agreements about payment and transfer. The sale was scheduled for May 23rd, 5 days after Marcus planned to give Caleb his freedom. Why? Why would Marcus free Caleb with one hand and sell him with the other? The answer is complicated and disturbing and reveals something essential about the nature of dependence and desperation. Marcus had known on some level that he couldn't survive without Caleb, not physically perhaps, but emotionally. The bond between them had become the center of his life, and he couldn't bear the thought of it ending. But he also knew he had to honor his promise, had to give Caleb the freedom he'd earned. The solution his twisted logic produced was this: give Caleb false freedom, let him believe he was free. Let him leave and then 5 days later execute the sale that legally superseded the Manum mission. Caleb's papers would be worthless because he'd already been sold. The buyer, Jackson, would have legal claim. Caleb would be captured, returned to slavery, and Marcus' conscience would be salved because technically he had freed Caleb. It just hadn't worked out. It was a betrayal of staggering magnitude, a final act of selfishness from a man who'd spent 23 years taking and taking from someone who had every right to hate him, but had instead saved him repeatedly without question. Marcus sealed the bill of sale and placed it in an envelope addressed to Jackson in Mississippi. The money had already been transferred. The contract was binding. All that remained was the execution. Caleb left the plantation on May 20th, 3 days before the scheduled sale. He took nothing but the clothes on his back, the Manum mission papers, and the account information for the money in Wilmington. Marcus watched from an upstairs window as Caleb walked down the long drive toward the main road, watched until he was out of sight, and then sat down on the floor of his empty bedroom and cried. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Hartwell was completely alone, and something shifted in him, something broke, or maybe something was finally released. He went to his desk, retrieved the sealed envelope containing the bill of sale, looked at it for a long time, and then he burned it. He took it to the kitchen, lit it on fire, and watched as the paper curled and blackened and turned to ash. Watched as his betrayal turned to smoke. He didn't know why he did it. Couldn't explain the impulse even to himself. Perhaps it was conscience finally asserting itself. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the recognition that some debts can't be held forever, that some bonds have to be released even when it destroys the person doing the releasing. Whatever the reason, Marcus burned the sale document and with it any legal claim on Caleb. Caleb was truly free. But Marcus didn't tell him, didn't send word, didn't let Caleb know that the threat, which Caleb might not have even known existed, had been eliminated. He simply sat in his empty house and waited. 3 days after Caleb left on May 23rd, Marcus fell ill. It started with a fever. By evening, he was shaking with chills, sweating through his sheets. By the next morning, he couldn't keep down food or water. Typhoid fever, common in the chaos of post-war North Carolina, spread through contaminated water and poor sanitation. Dr. Cross came and made his diagnosis. The prognosis was poor. Marcus was 50 years old, weakened by years of war privation. Without modern medicine, his chances of survival were perhaps 1 in 5. The two remaining household workers, freed people who had chosen to stay for wages Marcus could barely pay, did what they could, but it wasn't much. Typhoid required constant care, and Marcus was sinking fast. On the 4th day of his illness, delirious with fever, Marcus called for Caleb. "He's gone, sir," one of the attendants said gently. "He left last week. He's free. He's gone north, probably." "No," Marcus mumbled, his eyes unfocused. "No, he wouldn't leave. He knows I need him. He always knows. He'll come. He'll save me." "He always saves me." But Caleb didn't come. Why would he? He was free. He had his papers, his money. He had a whole life waiting for him somewhere far from the plantation that had held him for 47 years. Unless Caleb had never left. Unless he'd been there the whole time, watching, waiting. The theory that has been passed down through generations of local families is this: Caleb didn't go north. He stayed in the area, hiding in the woods near the plantation. He was there when Marcus burned the bill of sale. Was there when Marcus fell ill. Was there watching as Marcus called for him repeatedly. And Caleb made a choice. For 18 times he had saved Marcus's life, had stepped between him and death again and again, had carried the burden of his master's survival for 23 years. Now finally, he had his freedom. And Marcus was dying, calling for him, needing him one more time. Caleb could have saved him. One more time, one final rescue. Instead, he watched and he let Marcus die. Not through violence, not through poison or suffocation or any direct act. Simply through absence, through the withdrawal of protection that had been extended for so long. It was the ultimate revenge. Not murder, but permission. Permission for death to finally take the man it had been reaching for since 1842. Or perhaps it wasn't revenge at all. Perhaps it was mercy releasing Marcus from his dependence, releasing himself from the obligation that had defined his entire adult life. Perhaps it was simply a man choosing himself finally after decades of choosing someone else. We'll never know because Caleb never told anyone. He disappeared after May 23, 1865, and was never seen again in North Carolina. Marcus Hartwell died on May 23, 1865 at 3:00 in the afternoon. Dr. Cross recorded the cause of death as typhoid fever. The funeral was small, just Dr. Cross, the 2 household workers, and a minister who barely knew Marcus. Catherine was notified but didn't arrive in time for the burial. She came a week later to handle his estate, which consisted of mostly debts and a crumbling house. It was Catherine who found Marcus's private ledger, the one where he'd recorded every life-saving incident. 18 entries, each one dated and described. And on the final page, a note in Marcus's handwriting, written shortly before he fell ill. "I freed him. I should have freed him 20 years ago, but I freed him. And now he's gone and I'm alone. And I understand, finally, that this was always how it had to end. He gave me 23 years I didn't deserve. He kept me alive long enough to learn that being alive isn't the same as having a life worth living. I hope he finds happiness. I hope he never thinks of me again. I hope he lives to be a 100 and spends every day grateful that he survived me. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I hope he knows that in the end I did the right thing. It just took me far too long to do it." Catherine also found correspondence from a slave trader named Jackson. Letters negotiating the sale of Caleb, but she found no bill of sale. No completion of the transaction, just negotiations that seemed to have ended abruptly. She hired investigators to find Caleb, to warn him, to make sure he was safe, to perhaps even offer additional compensation as a kind of posthumous apology from Marcus. But Caleb had vanished completely. The money in the Wilmington bank account was never withdrawn. The account sat untouched for years until the bank finally claimed it for uncollected funds. Either Caleb never tried to access it, or he'd moved far enough north that returning to Wilmington was impossible, or perhaps he didn't want the money. Perhaps that would have felt too much like payment for something that shouldn't have required payment. Perhaps he wanted to build his new life entirely on his own terms without Marcus money anchoring him to the past. The plantation was sold in 1866. Catherine returned to Charleston with her daughters and eventually remarried. She died in 1891, taking whatever additional knowledge she had about Marcus and Caleb to her grave. The new owner of the plantation turned it into a lumber operation. The main house burned down in 1874. Local legend says it was arson set by former enslaved people who didn't want the place standing as a monument to their suffering. Nothing remains of the Hartwell plantation now except some foundation stones and a historical marker that mentions the family in passing. But the story survived over the years. Different versions emerged. Some said Caleb escaped to Philadelphia, where he lived under an assumed name, and eventually died a free man in 1910, 92 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren who never knew he'd been born into slavery. Others said he never left North Carolina, that he lived in the woods, a hermit haunted by the memory of Marcus calling for him. That he died in the 1880s and was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Cape Fear River basin. The darkest version, whispered but never confirmed, said that Caleb was caught by slave catchers despite his manumission papers. That Jackson, the traitor, had somehow found him and claimed him anyway, using forged documents. That Caleb died in Mississippi in 1867, still enslaved despite everything. But the most persistent version, the one that has become part of local folklore, is the one about choice. That Caleb stayed near the plantation those final days, that he heard Marcus calling for him, that he stood in the woods listening to his former master beg for help one last time. And he chose to walk away, not out of hatred, not even out of revenge, but out of a simple, profound understanding that he had paid his debt in full, that he had given enough, that he had earned the right to choose himself. If this version is true, and we'll never know if it is, then Caleb's final gift to Marcus was not salvation, but release. The end of the codependent bond that had sustained them both and trapped them both for 23 years. Sometimes the greatest act of mercy is letting someone face their fate alone. Sometimes freedom isn't just about gaining rights. It's about withdrawing responsibilities that should never have been yours in the first place. The story of Marcus Hartwell and Caleb exists in fragments. Plantation records, bills of sale, letters, doctor. Cross's medical notes, Catherine's correspondence, the testimony of people who lived on the plantation and passed stories down to their descendants. But the emotional truth, the why behind the what, remains elusive. Why did Caleb stay so long? Why did he save Marcus repeatedly when he could have let him die and potentially gained his freedom sooner? Was it strategic calculation, fear of consequences, a twisted form of affection? Or something else entirely? A sense of purpose that slavery couldn't quite extinguish even as it tried to crush every other aspect of his humanity? And Marcus? Was his dependence on Caleb a form of respect, however warped? Did he genuinely care about Caleb as a person? Or did he simply value him as the tool that kept him alive? Did Marcus burn the bill of sale out of conscience, or out of the recognition that he didn't want to live in a world where he'd committed that final betrayal? These questions have no clean answers. And perhaps that's appropriate because the relationship between Marcus and Caleb was never clean. It was built on an obscene foundation, the ownership of one human by another. And no amount of mutual dependence or strange affection could make that foundation less obscene. What we can say with certainty is this: two men lived and died in ways that were profoundly shaped by each other. One owned the other's body, the other owned the first one's survival. And in the end, when all the legal bonds were finally broken, neither man could exist in the way they had before. Marcus died alone, calling for someone who wasn't there. And Caleb, wherever he went, whatever life he built, carried the weight of 18 rescues, 23 years of vigilance, and the final decision to let death come when it knocked one last time. The slave who saved his master's life 18 times over 23 years and was sold or nearly sold the same day he died. Except that's not quite how the story ended, is it? Because Marcus died, but Caleb lived. And maybe that's the real ending. Not the betrayal, not the death, but the survival. Caleb survived Marcus, survived slavery, survived the weight of being someone else's salvation. And wherever he went, whatever name he took, however long he lived, he was free. Finally, completely free, even if freedom meant carrying memories that would never quite leave him. Even if it meant wondering sometimes if he'd done the right thing by walking away. Even if it meant living with the knowledge that he'd held a man's life in his hands and had finally chosen to let go. That's the truest ending. the one without resolution or closure or easy morals. Just a man walking away from 23 years of servitude and choosing for the first time in his life to let someone else save themselves or not. Because that was no longer his responsibility. And freedom ultimately is the right to say, not my burden anymore. Not my responsibility, not my problem. I've given enough. I'm done. If this story has stayed with you, if you find yourself thinking about the bonds we form and the prices we pay for them, if you wonder about the thousands of untold stories like this one buried in the historical record, subscribe to this channel, because history isn't just about famous names and major battles. It's about people like Marcus and Caleb whose lives intersected in ways that revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature, about power, about the debts we incur, and the ways we do or don't repay them. The story of Marcus Hartwell and Caleb is documented in fragments scattered across archives in North Carolina and South Carolina. The full truth of what happened between them, the emotional reality beneath the legal documents, remains unknowable. But the questions persist. What do you owe someone who has saved your life? What do you owe someone who has owned your life? Can gratitude exist between master and slave? Or is the power imbalance too great for genuine feeling to survive? And when does loyalty become codependence? When does protection become prison? When does saving someone repeatedly become a form of control, even if that control flows in unexpected directions? These are questions without easy answers. And that's why this story haunts us over a century and a half after the fact. Because it's not really about slavery, though. Slavery is the framework that made it possible. It's about human connection in impossible circumstances, about the choices we make when there are no good options, about the prices we pay for needing people and being needed by them, about the moment when someone who has given everything finally chooses to give nothing more and walks away free. Finally free.